Private Daniel Harlow leaned his back against the damp, dirt-packed wall of the trench, his body sagging under the weight of exhaustion. The smell of wet earth and gunpowder clung to his uniform like a second skin, and he had long since stopped, trying to brush away the grime. His rifle rested across his lap, its wooden stock streaked with mud, the metal cool beneath his fingers. He hadn't fired it in hours, but he clung to it the way a drowning man clutches driftwood, because out here, a rifle was not just a weapon, it was survival. The trench stretched on in both directions, a scar carved into the land, lined with slumped bodies of soldiers who looked just as broken as he felt. Some smoked, the faint glow of cigarettes glowing like dying stars. Others sat silently, staring at nothing in particular, their eyes hollow from weeks of relentless tension. Somewhere to his left, a man coughed deep, ragged, and endless. It blended with the faint hum of artillery, far off in the distance, a sound so constant it had become part of Daniel's world, like wind or rain. For a rare moment, the war felt far away. Daniel closed his eyes, tilting his head back against the cold earth wall. In the stillness, his mind betrayed him, carrying him away from this nightmare and back to Ohio. He pictured his mother's garden in the spring, tulips bursting through soft soil, their colors bold against the greening grass. He remembered his father's voice calling him in for supper, the smell of stew heavy in the air. He saw his little sister Annie, chasing fireflies barefoot across the lawn, her laughter brighter than any sound in France. He opened his eyes before the memory could twist into pain. War had a way of turning even the sweetest images into torment, because home felt like a dream he might never touch again. His chest tightened with the thought, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, pressing his palms against his knees. For now, he was here, in this trench, in this moment. That had to be enough. The dirt beneath him was cold, soaked from yesterday's rain. His boots were still wet, socks stiff and crusted. He wriggled his toes, though he couldn't feel much anymore. Every man in the trench carried the same look-gaunt faces, cracked lips, uniforms clinging like damp rags. War didn't just starve men of food. It starved them of comfort, of dignity. Daniel ran a hand through his matted hair and wiped mud across his cheek without realizing it. He shifted his gaze toward the captain. The man stood a few yards ahead, a tall, broad-shouldered figure silhouetted against the dimming sky. His uniform was as dirty as everyone else's, but there was something different about the way he carried himself. He didn't sag. He didn't slump. His presence alone seemed to anchor the chaos. Daniel had never decided whether he admired or resented that. Around him, murmurs passed between soldiers. Some whispered about rations, others about letters from home. One man, Jenkins, pulled out a photo of his wife, staring at it with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. Daniel looked away, guilt gnawing at him for even glancing at something so private. He leaned his head back again, letting his eyelids drift closed. Just a moment, he thought. Just a moment of rest. His breath slowed. The cold seeped through his uniform, but he embraced it, because in that stillness, the war seemed to fade. That was when it happened. A voice, loud and sharp, tore through the fragile quiet. Everyone move out now. Daniel's eyes shot open, his heart hammering so violently it drowned out everything else. The captain's voice carried over the trench like a thunderclap, leaving no room for hesitation, no space for questions. It was a command as clear as the crack of a rifle, and it hit Daniel harder than any blast. Around him, the men sprang to life. Cigarettes were dropped into the mud, rifles snatched up, boots scraping against the wooden planks of the trench floor. Shouts overlapped, curses hissed, bodies collided in the rush to prepare. The fragile illusion of rest shattered instantly. Daniel froze for a heartbeat, his body stiff, his mind caught between disbelief and dread. Move out? Now? They had been told to hold position. For hours they had sat here, waiting, unsure of what lay ahead. He had almost convinced himself they might stay in this trench until relief came. But now, the order had been given, and there was no turning back. He pushed himself upright, mud sticking to his uniform, and gripped his rifle. His hands trembled as he checked the magazine, fingers fumbling with the cold metal. His pulse pounded in his ears, louder than the distant artillery. His throat went dry. Beside him, Mason stood, his face set in grim determination. Mason glanced at Daniel, offering the smallest of nods. That single gesture steadied him, reminding Daniel he wasn't alone. Still, fear clung to him like the mud on his boots. The trench that moments ago had felt like a coffin now seemed like a sanctuary he was being ripped away from. The walls of earth, the stench, the filth, he had hated it, but at least it offered protection. Out there, beyond the lip of the trench, was open ground. Out there, death waited in shadows. On your feet. The captain barked again, his voice unwavering, slicing through doubt. Daniel's body obeyed even as his mind screamed to resist. He climbed the wooden ladder, every rung heavier than the last, every movement dragging him closer to the unknown. His boots slipped once, catching on the slick rung, but Mason's steady hand pushed him upward. Together they rose, one step at a time, leaving the trench behind. The air above felt sharper, colder, as if the world itself knew what was coming. Daniel's eyes adjusted to the fading light, the sky painted in bruised hues of red and gray. The battlefield stretched endlessly. Before him, pocked with craters, littered with remnants of battles past. Smoke drifted lazily across the horizon, carrying with it the metallic tone of blood and the sour reek of burned earth. Daniel's breath caught, his legs wavered. Yet he stood, rifle in hand, because the captain had ordered it, and because in war, hesitation was as fatal as a bullet. For a brief moment, silence hung heavy, the calm before the inevitable storm. Daniel felt the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The echoes of his mother's voice, his father's lessons, his sister's laughter, all colliding with the brutal reality of where he stood. Then the captain raised his arm, signaling forward, and Daniel knew rest was over. The fight was about to begin. The trench came alive with chaos the moment the captain's order echoed down its length. What had been a graveyard of stillness only seconds earlier transformed into a storm of motion. Boots slammed against wooden planks, rifles clattered against helmets, and men cursed as they scrambled to obey. The fragile pocket of silence Daniel had clung to evaporated, replaced by a violent urgency that stole his breath. Daniel tightened his grip on his rifle. His hands were shaking, though he willed them still. He had been through drills, through smaller skirmishes, even through days when the enemy fire never ceased. But there was something different in the captain's tone, something final, something absolute that filled him with dread. To his right, Jenkins cursed loudly, shoving cartridges into his pack with frantic hands. "Damn it, damn it, damn it," he muttered, the rhythm of panic spilling out of him like a chant. Further down, O'Connor fumbled with his bayonet, his face ghostly pale. Another man dropped his helmet into the mud, retrieved it with shaking fingers, then slapped it onto his head as though it might save him from what awaited. Corporal Mason was calm, or at least he looked calm. His face was tight, jaw clenched, eyes steady as he adjusted the strap on his pack and slung his rifle over his shoulder. Mason had always carried himself differently, grounded, collected, as though fear had no real claim over him. Daniel had once asked how he did it. Mason's reply had been simple, because the men around me can't afford for me not to. Now Mason glanced at Daniel. Their eyes met in the dim light, and for just a second, Daniel thought he saw something flicker their fear, buried deep beneath the mask of control. But Mason gave him a sharp nod, as if to say, "Come on, don't freeze on me now." Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt raw, his mouth dry as ash. He wanted to speak, to ask why now, why this, what the captain knew that they didn't. But there was no time for questions. Orders in war weren't invitations. They were commands, carved into stone, immutable as fate. The captain stood at the front, his voice carrying over the din. "Gear up, rifles ready, we're moving now." His tone brooked no hesitation. The way he spoke, you could almost believe he knew the outcome, that this wasn't a march into uncertainty, but a step into destiny. Daniel hated him for it, and he admired him for it, too. "Let's go," Mason said firmly, his voice breaking through Daniel's spinning thoughts. Daniel blinked, forcing his body into motion. He checked his ammunition, hands fumbling as he slid rounds into place. His fingers were stiff, half numb from the cold, and twice he nearly dropped the cartridges. Each failure burned him with shame, but Mason didn't comment. Mason simply waited, his eyes never leaving him, his presence steady like an anchor in a raging sea. At last, Daniel slung his rifle, adjusted the strap across his chest, and tightened his helmet. The weight of it all bore down on him, gear, weapon, fear, but beneath it was something else too, inevitability. The trench no longer felt like shelter. It had been a coffin for hours, and now it was a cage. The mud walls pressed in close, claustrophobic, suffocating. Every soldier knew it. If they stayed, they'd be buried here. Better to face open ground than rot in a hole waiting for death to find them. "On your feet." The captain barked again. The command surged through Daniel like a current, jolting his legs upright. He staggered, nearly slipping on the slick boards of the trench floor, but Mason's hand gripped his arm, steadying him. Together they stood, shoulders brushing, both staring at the ladder that led upward. It wasn't tall, just a simple set of wooden rungs, mud-slicked, worn down by boots. But to Daniel, it looked like the edge of the world. Beyond it lay no man's land, an endless stretch of cratered soil, wire, and smoke, where men were unmade in seconds. His chest tightened, his breath came shallow, too fast. Mason leaned close. "Breathe," he muttered. Daniel tried. Air scraped his throat like sandpaper, but he inhaled again, steadying himself. Men began to climb. One after another, they hauled themselves upward, boots kicking against the rungs, rifles clutched close. The trench shuddered with the noise of bodies scrambling out of its embrace. Each man who disappeared over the edge seemed to vanish into another reality, leaving those below wondering if they'd ever see him again. Daniel's turn came too quickly. Mason gave him a shove toward the ladder, and his boots found the bottom rung almost without him realizing it. He gripped the sides, wood rough against his fingers, and lifted himself upward. His arms trembled, but not from fatigue, from fear. Every inch higher, his pulse quickened. His helmet knocked against the wall as he climbed. Mud crumbled, falling in clumps onto his shoulders. His boots slipped once, skidding against the rung, and panic surged, hot and fast in his chest. But Mason's voice carried up from below, steady and unshaken. "Keep moving, Harlow. Don't stop." Daniel gritted his teeth and climbed. The top loomed, a thin slice of gray sky above. Cold air rushed down into the trench, sharp and metallic, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of smoke, and something fouler blood burned into the soil. His hands gripped the final rung. His eyes lifted, catching sight of the battlefield stretched before them. It was worse than he remembered. The field was a graveyard disguised as earth, cratered and broken, littered with shards. of helmets, torn packs, and the remnants of men. The tree line beyond was jagged, dark, and alive with menace. It seemed to watch him, waiting, daring him to step into its sight. For a heartbeat, Daniel froze. He wanted to retreat, to slide back into the mud, to beg Mason to go ahead without him. But Mason's hand pressed against his back, firm, unyielding. And the captain's voice cut through the growing hum of fear, sharp as ever. "Forward, men! Forward!" Daniel drew in a ragged breath. His boots cleared the edge of the trench. His body rose into the open air, exposed at last to the waiting sky. Behind him, the trench receded like a memory. Ahead of him, the battlefield yawned wide, merciless, inevitable. There was no going back now. Daniel's boots sank into the churned earth as he emerged fully from the trench, each step heavier than the last. The field stretched endlessly before him, a scarred wasteland painted in muted shades of mud and smoke. Craters from shell fire yawned like jagged teeth, and twisted remnants of barbed wire clawed at the sky. Daniel's throat tightened. The open expanse felt unnatural after the claustrophobic embrace of the trench. It was vulnerable, merciless. He glanced at Mason, whose face remained calm, a steadying presence amid the chaos. Mason's gaze swept the horizon, calculating, analyzing, searching for threats that Daniel's mind barely dared imagine. The captain strode ahead with unshakable purpose, boots crunching against debris, rifle slung at his side. Behind him, the soldiers followed like a reluctant tide, their movements cautious, tense, as though each footfall could trigger a trap. Daniel tried to focus, to steady his breathing, but the fear gnawed at him relentlessly. Every snapping twig, every distant echo of artillery, felt magnified, amplified by the fragile silence of anticipation. He remembered the training. Keep low, move fast, watch for enemy positions, never hesitate. But this was no simulation. This was open ground, pockmarked with danger, and he was painfully aware of how small he truly was. To his left, Jenkins stumbled, tripping over uneven mud. He cursed, a sharp, broken sound that made Daniel flinch. O'Connor hissed, adjusting his grip on a rifle. Men whispered to themselves, recited prayers, muttered the names of wives, sisters, mothers. Each sound seemed loud in the empty expanse, a fragile attempt to cling to sanity. Daniel's mind flashed again to Ohio, to the quiet fields back home, the warm kitchen, the laughter of Annie as she chased fireflies. That memory felt impossibly distant, almost cruel. Here, the smell of mud and gunpowder burned in his nose, and the horizon offered no comfort. "Keep moving," Mason said softly, his voice carrying just enough to reach Daniel. Daniel nodded, forcing himself to step forward. The mud pulled at his boots, the uneven terrain threatening to trip him. At every stride, he fired glances at the tree line ahead, dark and jagged, each shadow concealing potential death. His palms were slick with sweat, despite the chill that had settled into his bones. The captain's hand shot up, signaling a pause. "Spread out. Keep formation," he ordered, his tone low but commanding. Daniel obeyed, adjusting his distance from Mason and the soldiers around him. He tried to memorize every crater, every mound, every potential point of cover. The field seemed to stretch on forever. Daniel's muscles screamed in protest, but fear and adrenaline propelled him forward. Each step was a negotiation between instinct and duty, the old, comfortable rhythms of the trench replaced by a constant gnawing tension. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught his eye near the tree line. His pulse spiked. He raised his rifle instinctively, heart hammering. Shadows shifted. A figure appeared, then vanished. Daniel's hands shook. His mind raced through possibilities. An enemy scout, a hidden machine gun, a trap. He swallowed, trying to steady his breathing, trying not to betray his terror. Mason's voice was calm beside him. "Watch the horizon. Don't stop. Don't hesitate." Daniel nodded again, his throat tight. He took a deep breath and moved. Forward, every step deliberate, controlled, though his legs felt like lead. The mud clung to his boots, pulling him down, threatening to rob him of momentum. Around him, the other soldiers were struggling too. Jenkins cursed at every obstacle, his voice tight with fear. O'Connor stumbled several times, regaining balance only with the help of his comrades. Yet despite the chaos, there was a rhythm, a fragile coordination that held the line together. The captain stopped suddenly, hand raised. Daniel froze mid-step, heart in his throat. A silence stretched, oppressive, until the captain finally gestured forward again. They pressed on, boots sinking, rifles clutched tight. Daniel's chest burned, lungs aching, yet he forced himself to keep pace. The field offered no mercy, no reassurance. Every crater could hide a sniper, every mound a sudden ambush. He knew that one mistake could be his last. He stole a glance at Mason, whose calmness now seemed almost unnatural. Daniel wondered how he could appear so composed while the world around them teetered on the brink of chaos. Mason's eyes scanned constantly, reading the terrain, anticipating danger, a living compass of survival. Daniel envied him and feared that if Mason faltered, the cracks in their line might be fatal. A sudden explosion rocked the ground to Daniel's right. Dirt and debris flew into the air, and he was thrown forward, tumbling into a shallow crater. His rifle skidded across the mud. He scrambled to recover it, coughing, ears ringing. Smoke filled his nose, and the acrid scent of gunpowder burned his lungs. "Daniel, get up!" Mason shouted, sliding beside him, pushing him upright. The calm composure returned instantly, as if the blast had barely touched him. Daniel's hands were trembling violently now. His fingers gripped the rifle so tightly that pain shot through his knuckles. But he forced himself to stand, forcing his legs to move, one after another. The captain's voice cut through the haze, commanding and steady. "Hold formation, eyes forward. Don't break line." Men around Daniel were yelling, reacting, scrambling to take cover behind small rises in the mud, behind remnants of barbed wire. Daniel followed instinct, ducking low, keeping his profile minimal, yet moving forward relentlessly. He thought of home again, the gardens, the fireflies, the quiet streets, but the memory was fleeting, swallowed immediately by the roaring chaos of war. He forced himself back into the present, into the rhythm of survival. The tree line loomed closer, dark and foreboding. Each step brought Daniel closer to potential death, but also closer to survival. He focused on Mason, on the captain, on the men moving with them. Each face was a reminder that they weren't alone, that even amid the chaos, there was strength in unity. A sudden whistling sound pierced the air. A bullet zipped past Daniel's head, striking the ground with a wet smack. He dove instinctively, mud coating his uniform, heart hammering. Another shot followed, and then another. He fired back blindly, each squeeze of the trigger a desperate plea for survival. The captain raised his hand, signaling forward. "Advance! Keep moving!" Daniel pushed up, coughing, limbs heavy with exhaustion, mud, and terror. Each movement was a battle, each step forward a small victory. The field stretched before him, open and unyielding, but he moved nonetheless. By the time they reached a shallow rise in the terrain, Daniel's chest burned, arms ached, and sweat mixed with mud streaked his face. But he had survived the first stretch. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to realize that he had made it this far. He glanced at Mason, who gave him a short nod. That silent acknowledgment carried weight heavier than any words could convey. They were still alive. They were still moving forward. And for now, that was enough. But Daniel knew the real test had only just begun. The world erupted. One moment the field was silent, tense with anticipation, and the next it became a storm of violence. Bullets screamed through the air, whistling past ears, striking the earth with sharp metallic cracks. Explosions shook the ground beneath Daniel's boots, hurling dirt and shards of mud into the air, clinging to uniforms, masking vision. He fell instinctively into a shallow crater, chest pressed to the wet soil, rifle clutched as though it were a lifeline. "Get down! Move!" Mason shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of gunfire. Daniel's body reacted before his mind could catch up. His legs tucked beneath him, arms wrapped around the rifle, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed to curl into a ball, to disappear into the mud, but the captain's voice rang out again, relentless. "Forward! Keep moving, don't stop." The open field, once terrifying in its emptiness, now became a labyrinth of danger. Craters that might have offered cover seemed shallow and ineffective, every mound a potential death trap. He could see men ducking, shouting, some falling, some scrambling to return fire. Every second stretched endlessly, a brutal test of reflexes and courage. Daniel spotted Jenkins nearby, frozen with wide eyes, hands shaking as he raised his rifle. A shot cracked near Jenkins' ear, and the man ducked instinctively, swearing under his breath. Daniel wanted to reach him, to steady him, but Mason pressed against his back, urging him forward. There was no time for hesitation. He forced his legs to move, each stride a defiance against the screaming fear in his chest. Mud sucked at his boots, pulling him down, but the battlefield demanded forward motion. His rifle bucked in his hands. As he fired blindly toward the tree line, each shot a desperate plea to survive. Explosions rocked the ground to his right, throwing him to his knees. Dirt and fragments struck his helmet, gritty and cold. He coughed, vision blurred by smoke and flying soil. Mason's hand caught his arm, pulling him to cover behind a low rise. The corporal's calmness in the midst of chaos was almost infuriating Daniel. Hated him for it, even as he leaned into the reassurance it provided. "Stay down. Watch your flank," Mason shouted, firing over the ridge. Daniel's body was tense, every muscle coiled with fear. He pressed into the mud, trying to suppress the trembling, trying to think. But thought was impossible here. Survival depended on instinct. He fired again, sensing but not seeing the enemy, the recoil jarring his shoulder. Around him, men screamed, shouted orders, or fell into the earth with fatal finality. The tree line loomed, dark and jagged, and from its shadows came bursts of enemy fire, cutting through the field like angry lightning. Daniel ducked low, feeling the sting of dirt kicked up by bullets, the thunderous thump of shells exploding nearby. His ears rang, heart hammering violently. Each moment felt like an eternity, each breath a victory over panic. A sudden explosion erupted just yards away, hurling Daniel sideways into a crater. His rifle skidded across the mud. Pain shot through his ribs, and for a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe. Then Mason's voice broke through the roar. "Get up! Now!" Daniel struggled, coughing, spitting mud from his mouth. He grabbed his rifle, forcing his body upright, chest heaving, vision swimming. Around him, men were either advancing or falling. The sound of shouting, gunfire, and screaming mingled into a terrifying symphony of chaos. The captain appeared ahead, standing tall amid the storm, his rifle raised, arm gesturing forward. Daniel's fear threatened to freeze him, but the sight of the captain unshaken, unbroken, sparked something inside. Survival wasn't just about fleeing danger. It was about facing it, step by step, moment by moment. Daniel moved, following the captain's lead, firing sporadically into the shadows of the tree line. Each shot was a gamble, each step an assertion of life against the ever-present threat of death. Bullets whizzed past him, thudding into earth, tearing up dirt, splintering wood. He stumbled into a crater, pressed his body low, and fired blindly, trusting only instinct. Mason slid beside him again, crouching, eyes sharp, scanning for movement. "Here, over here," he shouted, gesturing toward a shallow mound that offered partial cover. Daniel crawled toward it, heart in his throat, mud soaking his uniform. Around them, men fell. Some cried out in pain, others silently collapsed into the mud, life extinguished in a heartbeat. Daniel swallowed hard, gripping his rifle tighter, forcing himself to focus. He could not think of the dead. He could only think of survival, of every movement, of every breath. Another explosion erupted nearby, hurling dirt and fragments into Daniel's face. He coughed violently, vision blurred, and for a moment he feared he might be blinded. Mason's hand gripped his shoulder, pulling him down, keeping him grounded. The corporal's calm was a tether in the storm, a lifeline of human stability amid unrelenting terror. Daniel fired again, shots deafened by the chaos. Every target seemed indistinct, every shadow potentially lethal. He realized with a jolt that the field was alive with danger, not abstract, but tangible, immediate, breathing, ready to consume him. He could feel it, a predator stalking, waiting for a misstep. The captain's voice rang out once more, cutting through the cacophony. "Forward, do not stop. Hold your line." Daniel's body obeyed, though his mind screamed for rest, for safety, for home. Step by step, he advanced, firing when necessary, ducking when needed, praying silently that he and Mason would survive this hellish field. The tree line seemed to loom ever closer, a wall of dark menace, from which more gunfire erupted, sharper, more precise. Daniel flinched, ducking instinctively, bullets kicking up mud beside him. He felt the sting of a near miss on his shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he ignored it. Survival meant ignoring pain. Survival meant moving forward. Jenkins screamed nearby, a high, raw sound of terror, as he went down, clutching his leg. Daniel's stomach churned, but Mason grabbed his arm and pulled him onward. "We keep moving. We don't stop. Come on." Daniel obeyed, boots slipping. In mud, lungs burning, muscles trembling. Every movement was agony, but he forced himself forward, keeping pace with Mason, keeping sight of the captain. Every second was measured, every heartbeat a small victory. Another explosion ripped across the field. Daniel fell face first into the mud, ears ringing, chest heaving. He tasted dirt, grit, and smoke. Yet when he struggled upright, he realized he was alive. Mason was alive beside him. The captain was still ahead, leading. And somehow, against the chaos, they were advancing. Daniel's fear was raw, unrelenting, but so was his determination. The field was a nightmare, but he moved through it, rifle clutched, boots sinking, heart racing. He realized with a shiver that this was what it meant to fight, not to kill. Not to triumph, but to survive, moment by moment, breath by breath, step by step. And as they pressed forward, closer to the tree line, Daniel understood. This was only the beginning. The real test, the confrontation with enemy fire, with death, with the chaos of war, was yet to come. Daniel's lungs burned as he stumbled across the scarred battlefield, mud sucking at his boots with every desperate step. Around him, men were shouting, some in pain, some in command, others only screaming at the chaos of the moment. The open ground that had seemed endless before now felt claustrophobic. Every crater, mound, and spike of barbed wire, a potential death sentence. His hands ached, gripping the rifle so tightly that his knuckles were white. Every breath was ragged, every heartbeat a reminder of the fragility of life. Mason was beside him, sliding low behind a shallow mound. "Stay close," he shouted, firing over the ridge with precise, controlled movements. His calm in the maelstrom was infuriating and inspiring all at once. Daniel wanted to curse at him, to beg him to admit fear, but there was no time. Fear here was lethal. Bullets whizzed past, striking the mud around them with sharp claps. An explosion to their right sent shards of dirt and wood flying, rattling against Daniel's helmet and throwing him forward. He slammed into the ground, coughing, tasting grit and blood. Mason grabbed his arm, hauling him upright and pushing him toward another mound. Daniel's legs burned, muscles threatening to give way, but he forced them forward. Survival demanded it. The captain appeared ahead, still a figure of composure amid the storm. He barked orders, gesturing for soldiers to take cover and fire in controlled bursts. Daniel followed, peering over the mound to aim his rifle at the dark line of the tree line. The enemy fire was relentless, unyielding, a constant presence that made each second stretch impossibly long. Another explosion rocked the ground, closer this time, hurling Daniel sideways into the mud. Pain flared across his shoulder and ribs, but he forced himself upright, gripping the rifle again. Mason clapped a hand on his back, steadying him, and Daniel pressed forward. He fired, blindly at first, then with more intent as he caught glimpses of movement in the trees. Time had distorted. Minutes and hours seemed indistinguishable as Daniel ran, fired, ducked, and crawled. The roar of artillery, the crack of bullets, and the screams of men became a single, unrelenting storm. He felt fatigue clawing at every limb, but adrenaline and fear carried him onward. A soldier nearby collapsed, clutching a leg, screaming. Daniel wanted to reach him, to help, but Mason shoved him forward. "Keep moving," he yelled. "Every second counts." Daniel's stomach churned with guilt, but the lesson was clear. Survival here meant focus, precision, and relentless motion. Pause and you became another casualty, another body sprawled in mud. Daniel's mind flashed to Ohio, the quiet town, his family's warm home, Annie chasing fireflies. He swallowed the memory quickly, pushing it away. There was no room for longing here. There was only the field, the fire, and the next decision, move or die. Another round of gunfire erupted. Daniel dove into a crater, chest pressed against cold earth. His hands shook as he raised the rifle. Mason crouched beside him, eyes sharp, scanning. "Ready on 3, Mason shouted. Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. They fired simultaneously, the recoil jolting Daniel's shoulder painfully. The shots found no clear target, but the act itself was survival asserting presence, forcing the enemy to acknowledge them. The captain called out, "Advance!" Now, Daniel pressed forward, muscles screaming, lungs burning. Mud coated every inch of him, sweat and blood mixing with the grime. Each step was agony, each movement a rebellion against exhaustion. Around him, men were falling, others screaming, some moving with terrifying efficiency. An explosion rocked the field directly. Ahead, Daniel was thrown off his feet, landing hard in mud. He spat grit and blood, coughing violently, heart hammering. Mason's hand found his shoulder, pulling him upright. "We move!" Mason shouted. Daniel obeyed, trembling, every nerve on fire. Bullets whipped past, embedding themselves in earth, splintering wood. Daniel fired when he could, each shot a desperate attempt to assert control over chaos. Every figure in the distance seemed both phantom and threat, and every second held the possibility of death. The tree line was closer now, darker, more foreboding. Daniel's body ached, mind screaming, yet he forced himself onward. He moved with Mason, keeping pace with the captain, relying on instinct, training, and sheer will. The field seemed endless, yet every step forward was a triumph, a small victory over the overwhelming terror. Another soldier screamed as he fell. Beside them, clutching his chest, Daniel's stomach lurched. He had to look away, had to suppress the shock, had to survive. Mason's voice was steady, commanding, eyes forward. "Keep moving." Daniel followed, feeling the corporal's calm like a tether in the storm. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously. Moments of clarity, glimpses of the tree line. The captain's steady hand, Mason's guiding presence, intertwined with terror, pain, and the roar of fire. Daniel's muscles ached, heart racing, but he could not stop. Each pause could mean death. Each breath was borrowed. An explosion rocked the ground to their left, flinging mud and debris high. Daniel slammed into the earth, coughing, vision blurred. Mason shoved him forward again, shouting over the din, "Move, move now!" The corporal's voice was the only thing grounding him, tethering him to the fragile notion of survival. They reached a shallow mound that offered partial cover. Daniel pressed low, chest heaving, arms trembling. Bullets kicked up dirt around him. He could see men retreating, some falling, some firing blindly. Yet here, even in the chaos, there was purpose, rhythm, a fragile coordination holding the line together. The captain's voice cut through. "Hold formation. Eyes forward. Keep pressure." Daniel followed, gripping his rifle tighter, aiming whenever he could. Each shot was a desperate assertion, a plea for survival. Around him, men fell, but some moved with terrifying efficiency, firing, ducking, advancing. Daniel realized that survival was not just instinct, it was coordination, trust, and willpower. Mason's hand clapped Daniel on the back. "We're still alive. That's what matters. Stay focused." Daniel nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. They were still alive. They were still moving forward. For now, that was enough. But deep in his bones, Daniel understood the unspoken truth. The field would demand more. Injuries, fear, and exhaustion would test every man. Every step forward was both defiance and desperation. And this was only the beginning. Daniel's boots sank into the churned mud as he pressed forward, each step heavier than the last. His lungs burned with every inhale. His chest ached from the exertion of crawling, running, and ducking, and his vision was blurred by sweat, smoke, and grime. The open field stretched like an endless pit before him, each crater and mound a potential death trap. Around him, the cacophony of war explosions, gunfire, and screams formed a relentless roar, drowning out thought, drowning out clarity. Mason was beside him, a rock of composure in the storm. The corporal moved with a calm precision, scanning, firing, adjusting, and leading with a confidence Daniel envied. His presence anchored Daniel in the chaos, forcing him to keep moving. Even as every fiber of his body begged for rest. "Stay low," Mason shouted as a shell exploded nearby, throwing a plume of dirt and fire into the air. Daniel slammed into the mud, coughing, choking on grit and smoke. His rifle skidded across the wet ground, and he scrambled to recover it, hands shaking violently. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he ignored it, driven only by instinct and the need to survive. Ahead, the captain moved like a phantom, rifle slung, scanning the tree line, gesturing forward. Daniel followed, step by agonizing step, trying to match the captain's rhythm despite exhaustion and fear. Every movement was a negotiation between will and weakness, between survival and surrender. Bullets screamed past, striking mud and splintering. Wood. Daniel pressed low behind a mound, chest trembling, arms shaking. Beside him, Mason fired with steady hands, the recoil barely noticeable in the corporal's composure. Daniel's heart ached at the contrast. He felt like a child beside. A man born for battle. Another explosion rocked the field to their right. Daniel was thrown to the ground, helmet digging into the mud. Dirt coated his mouth, nose, and eyes, making him gag. Mason grabbed his arm, hauling him upright and urging him forward. Each second was a test, each movement a defiance against the chaos around them. "Keep moving," Mason yelled, firing as he ran. Daniel forced himself to his feet, boots sliding in the mud. He fired when he could, blindly at first, then with a sense of purpose as he glimpsed movement in the tree line. Each shot was a plea for survival, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. Around him, men fell, some screaming, others silent, victims of the storm. The captain's voice rang out, cutting through the roar. "Advance! Forward! Hold your line!" Daniel pressed on, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fear that clawed at his chest. His muscles burned, lungs screamed, but he could not stop. Every step forward was defiance, a declaration that he would survive, that he would continue despite the odds. Another explosion flung Daniel sideways into a crater, mud coating his uniform. Pain shot through his ribs, but he forced himself upright. Again, Mason's hand clutched his shoulder, steadying him. "We move," he said simply, and Daniel obeyed. They pressed forward, closer to the tree line. The enemy fire grew heavier, sharper, more precise. Bullets tore through the air, splintering wood and hurling mud at their feet. Daniel ducked instinctively, fired when possible, each shot both an act of aggression and desperation. He tasted blood, grit, and smoke, the field alive with the stench of fear and death. Around them, men screamed. Some fell, some scrambled to cover. Daniel saw Jenkins collapse, clutching his leg, screaming in pain. Daniel wanted to help, but Mason shoved him onward. "Focus, we don't stop here." Daniel obeyed, swallowing hard. Every movement was agony, but survival demanded it. He glanced at the captain, whose voice and gestures cut through the chaos, guiding them, inspiring them, anchoring them in the midst of terror. A sudden explosion erupted just yards away, hurling Daniel into a crater. He pressed himself into the mud, coughing violently, spitting grit. Mason pulled him upright, firing as they ran. The corporal's calm presence was the only tether in the storm, the only thing keeping Daniel from collapsing in fear. Daniel realized, with a jolt, that this was war not glorious, not heroic, but raw, chaotic, and terrifying. It was survival, measured in inches, seconds, and heartbeats. Each step forward, each bullet fired, each decision to move or stay was life or death. The tree line loomed ever closer, dark and jagged, concealing the enemy's presence. Daniel could feel the tension coiling in his chest, a storm of fear and adrenaline. He pressed on, boots sinking into mud, body trembling with exhaustion. Mason's hand clutched his shoulder, guiding him, steadying him. The corporal's eyes scanned the horizon, calculating danger, predicting movement, a living compass of survival. Daniel fired again, shots echoing across the field. He could see men falling, others scrambling, the chaos unrelenting. Another explosion flung mud and debris into the air, coating his uniform and helmet. He swallowed grit and blood, forcing himself forward, step by step, breath by ragged breath. The captain's voice cut through the storm once more. "Forward! Advance! Hold your line!" Daniel obeyed, muscles burning, lungs aching, every nerve alight with fear. He glanced at Mason, who nodded, eyes sharp, hands steady. Daniel drew courage from him, moving with him, keeping pace, following the rhythm of survival. Around them, men fell, screams pierced the air, bullets tore the ground. Yet Daniel pressed on. Each step was a small victory, each breath a declaration. He would survive. The field was alive with danger, relentless, unyielding, but he pressed forward nonetheless. Another explosion rocked the ground near them. Daniel was thrown to the earth, coughing violently, heart hammering. Mason hauled him upright again, shouting over the roar, "We move! Don't stop!" Daniel's body screamed with exhaustion, pain, and fear, but he obeyed. Forward, forward, always forward. Each movement was defiance, a small assertion of life against the ever-present threat of death. The tree line loomed ahead, darker and more ominous. Daniel knew the real danger was waiting there, hidden, patient, ready to strike. His hands shook as he gripped his rifle, knuckles white. Each step was agony, but also a triumph. Each breath a fragile victory. And as they pressed forward, closer to the dark edge of the trees, Daniel realized the field had changed him. Fear was no longer paralysis. It was fuel. Pain was no longer reason to stop. It was a reminder that he was alive. The storm of bullets, explosions, and chaos was still raging, but he had survived so far, and that was enough to keep moving. The battlefield fell into a tense, trembling quiet. The relentless roar of gunfire and explosions had subsided, leaving only the occasional distant crack of artillery and the low moans of men too injured to move. Daniel's legs shook uncontrollably. Muscles burned, lungs still heaving from the constant exertion. His uniform was caked in mud, sweat, and blood, some of it his own, some of it from men he could only pray were alive. Mason crouched beside him, scanning the field, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. The corporal's calm was a lifeline amid the horror. Daniel envied him, yet leaned on his steady presence like a crutch. Without Mason, he might have succumbed to panic entirely. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to breathe normally, but each inhale felt like fire in his chest. He looked around. Craters yawned like jagged wounds, scattered bodies lay motionless, and the ground itself seemed scarred beyond repair. The tree line they had pushed toward loomed ominously, dark and foreboding, hiding dangers that had yet to reveal themselves. "Stay low," Mason muttered, his voice barely audible over the occasional distant gunfire. "We move slowly now. Watch for snipers, traps, and anything the enemy left behind." Daniel nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. His fingers were stiff, trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, yet he forced them to obey his commands. Every movement was deliberate, every step a negotiation with his own fear. He looked at the bodies of fallen soldiers, some familiar faces, some strangers. A pang of guilt twisted in his chest. Survivor's guilt, he realized, though the term itself felt inadequate. The weight of lives ended. The knowledge that he had survived while others had not, pressed down on him like a leaden shroud. Mason crouched next to him, glancing over the field. "We've got to move. Stay with me. Keep low." Daniel forced himself to nod again. He swallowed bile and mud, ignored the ache in his shoulder, the burn in his lungs, and rose carefully. Each step forward was agonizing, but the instinct to survive outweighed pain, fear, and doubt. The tree line loomed closer now. Shadows twisted in the corners of his vision, and every rustle of leaves or snapping twig made his body jump. He knew enemy soldiers could be waiting in ambush, ready to strike. The battlefield had claimed too many lives already. He couldn't let it claim him. A sudden groan drew his attention. Jenkins lay nearby, clutching his leg, face contorted in pain. Daniel wanted to stop, to help, but Mason's hand clamped onto his shoulder, shaking him gently but firmly. "Focus, Daniel. We help when we can, but not if it gets us killed. Move." Daniel's stomach churned, but he obeyed. Survival demanded. Focus. Focus demanded movement, and movement demanded suppression of every other thought. Step by step, he followed Mason, keeping low, eyes scanning for threats. The field ahead was pockmarked with craters and barbed wire remnants. Daniel's boots sank into mud at every step. Each movement was agony, muscles screaming, lungs burning, yet he pressed onward. Behind them, the occasional shout or groan reminded him of the chaos that had just passed. As they reached a small rise, Mason crouched and signaled Daniel to stop. "Look," he whispered, voice tense but controlled. Daniel squinted. Ahead, he could see signs of enemy presence: trampled mud, broken branches, shadows shifting unnaturally in the dim light. "Snipers," Mason muttered. "We move carefully, stay low, fire only if necessary." Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, but he obeyed. Each step was measured, deliberate, as they inched toward the tree line. Bullets still whizzed occasionally, distant but deadly. Every shadow seemed alive with menace. He forced himself to recall training: low profile, scanning constantly, anticipate danger. But reality was different from drills. Every rustle of leaves, every glint of metal, every shadow set his nerves on fire. Fear was constant, unrelenting, gnawing at him from the inside. They paused behind another mound. Daniel pressed his face to the mud, breathing shallowly. Mason whispered directions, guiding him past traps and craters. The corporal's presence was a lifeline, the only thing keeping Daniel tethered to survival. "Almost there," Mason said, voice low. "We need to clear the tree line. Enemy could be dug in. Watch your left." Daniel's hands shook violently as he raised his rifle slightly to scan ahead. Bullets kicked up dirt around him. He felt the sting of one grazing past his shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he ignored it. Step by step, breath by ragged breath, they pressed on. Ahead, the tree line darkened, thick with brush, concealment, and the unmistakable presence of enemy forces. Daniel's mind raced. Traps, ambushes, sniper nests. Every instinct screamed to stop, to retreat, to hide, but retreat meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Mason leaned close. "Ready?" he whispered. Daniel nodded, gripping his rifle with white-knuckled intensity. They moved forward together, low, silent, careful. The tree line loomed, shadows twisting, concealing movement. Daniel's stomach churned with adrenaline and fear. Each step felt monumental, as though the ground itself resisted their advance. Suddenly, a rustle of shadow moving unnaturally made Daniel fire instinctively. The shot rang out, echoing across the battlefield. Silence followed, broken only by distant groans and the occasional crack of artillery. Daniel swallowed hard, heart pounding. "Keep moving," Mason urged, sliding past him. "We clear the tree line, then we regroup. Focus on survival, Daniel. That's all that matters." Daniel forced himself forward. Mud clung to his boots, sweat and grime coating his face, yet he pressed onward, following Mason. The tree line was dense, hiding enemies, concealing death at every turn. Each step was agony, each movement a test of courage. A sudden shout erupted, a soldier yelling in pain as he collapsed nearby. Daniel flinched, heart hammering. Mason grabbed him, pulling him into cover behind a large fallen log. "We move slow now. Watch the gaps. Keep low," the corporal whispered. Daniel nodded, forced his breathing to slow, and pressed on again. Inch by inch, step by excruciating step. The field had changed him. Fear was no longer a threat to his motion. It was a fuel, pushing him forward, sharpening senses, heightening awareness. Finally, they reached the edge of the tree line. Daniel paused, chest heaving, muscles trembling violently, but alive. Mason crouched beside him, scanning. The field. Behind them was a nightmare, but here, at the tree line, there was a fragile chance to regroup, to catch breath, to prepare for the next trial. Daniel's hands shook as he lowered his rifle slightly. Around them, the battlefield was still strewn, with bodies, the scent of blood, and smoke thick in the air. He swallowed, forcing himself to focus on the present. Mason's voice was steady. "We're alive. That's what matters. We survived the worst of it. Now we move carefully, one step at a time." Daniel nodded, chest heaving, mind whirling, knowing Mason was right. Survival was all that mattered now. Everything else, the chaos, the carnage, the fear, was secondary. And as they stepped into the tree line, moving slowly, cautiously, Daniel understood the truth. The war was far from over. Every step forward was a defiance, every breath a fragile victory. And for now, that was enough to keep moving. The tree line was alive with menace, every shadow a potential enemy. Daniel's heart pounded, muscles trembling with exhaustion, adrenaline, and fear. Mud clung to his boots, sweat and grime streaked his face, and his rifle felt like an extension of his arm. Every breath was shallow, every heartbeat loud in his ears. Mason crouched beside him, scanning. His calm was a lifeline, the anchor Daniel clung to amid the storm. "Stay close. One step at a time. Eyes open," Mason whispered. Daniel nodded, forcing his trembling legs to obey. The captain was ahead, leading the advance with unwavering determination. Daniel kept his gaze on him, drawing courage from his composure. Survival depended on focus, and focus meant watching the captain, watching Mason, and moving forward. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire erupted from deep within the tree line. Daniel hit the mud, dirt flying into his mouth and eyes. Pain flared across his shoulder from a near miss, but he ignored it. Mason pressed against him, shoving him into a safer position behind a fallen tree. "Return fire! Suppress them!" the captain shouted. Daniel fired his rifle blindly, the recoil jolting his body. Around him, men were moving, ducking, firing, some falling, some advancing. Each second stretched endlessly, a test of reflex, will, and endurance. Bullets screamed past, striking wood, mud, and bodies with deafening cracks. An explosion rocked the ground nearby, hurling mud and debris into the air. Daniel slammed to the earth, coughing, choking on grit and smoke. Mason grabbed him, hauling him upright and into a shallow depression. "Keep moving. We push through." "Now," Mason yelled, firing over the edge as he moved. Daniel obeyed, forcing his legs to carry him forward. Each step was agony, but fear and survival instinct propelled him. The tree line seemed endless, yet the captain pressed on, a beacon in the chaos. Daniel drew courage from the unwavering figure ahead. Suddenly, a soldier screamed Jenkins, hit by a sniper. Daniel froze, stomach twisting. Mason's hand pressed firmly on his back, urging him forward. "Focus, Daniel. Keep moving." Daniel obeyed, forcing himself past the horror. Step by step, he advanced, mud and sweat streaking his face. His lungs burned, muscles ached, and exhaustion threatened to collapse him. But he pressed on. Survival demanded it. The tree line narrowed, shadows twisting. Daniel scanned desperately, rifle raised. Enemy soldiers emerged, firing with deadly precision. Daniel returned fire, adrenaline sharpening every sense. Around him, explosions rocked the ground, throwing dirt and debris into the air. Screams echoed, mixing with the roar of gunfire. Mason fired steadily beside him, each shot controlled and deliberate. Daniel followed, muscles trembling, heart hammering. Step by agonizing step, they advanced, ducking behind trees and fallen. Logs firing when necessary. A sudden explosion threw Daniel to the ground, helmet striking a tree. Pain shot through his ribs, and he coughed violently. Mason pulled him upright again, shoving him forward. "No stopping now," Daniel obeyed, gritting his teeth. The captain raised a hand, signaling a final push. They sprinted together, moving low, firing over cover, dodging bullets, and weaving between explosions. The enemy fire intensified, but Daniel's focus sharpened. Every second counted, every movement was life or death. They reached a small clearing within the tree line. Daniel pressed low, chest heaving, mud coating his uniform. Mason crouched beside him, scanning. Almost there. "One more push," he whispered. Daniel nodded, forcing his trembling legs to move. The enemy had fortified positions ahead, but the captain gestured toward a gap. It was narrow, dangerous, but passable. Daniel gritted his teeth, adjusting his grip on the rifle, and followed Mason through the clearing. Gunfire erupted from hidden positions. Daniel dove into mud, firing blindly, heart racing. Bullets struck nearby, splintering wood, hurling debris into the air. Mason pressed him forward, guiding him through the storm. Daniel's arms ached, fingers trembling, but he obeyed. Another explosion hurled him sideways into a shallow ditch. Pain flared across his shoulder and ribs, but he forced himself upright. Mason's eyes met his, sharp, unyielding. "We survived this. Focus." Daniel swallowed hard, adrenaline surging. Step by agonizing step, they advanced. Bullets cracked. Around them, trees splintered, mud flew into the air. The enemy fire was relentless, but so was Daniel's determination. Fear fueled him, sharpened every sense, and forced every muscle to obey. Finally, they reached the far edge of the tree line. Daniel pressed himself against a fallen log, chest heaving, mind reeling. Around him, the battlefield stretched silent. Smoke rising, bodies scattered. He was alive. Mason was alive. The captain was alive. Against the odds, they had survived. Mason clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We made it. That's what counts. We survived." Daniel nodded, chest heaving, mud streaking his face. He looked around, taking in the destruction, the carnage, the fallen men, the scarred land. Fear still lingered, but beneath it was a raw, undeniable relief. Survival. The captain approached, surveying the field. "Good work, men. You held your line. You pushed through. We lived to fight another day." His voice was calm, steady, carrying authority, but there was exhaustion in his eyes. Daniel understood. Leadership carried burdens invisible to the ordinary soldier. Daniel sank to the ground, arms trembling, heart pounding. Mason crouched beside him, eyes scanning, always alert, always ready. Daniel realized how much he had relied on him, how much he needed his presence to survive. The field had changed. Him, sharpened him, stripped away illusions of control and heroism, leaving only the raw reality of survival. Around them, soldiers tended to the injured, helped the fallen, and regrouped. Daniel watched, swallowing hard. Each survivor was a miracle, each breath a gift. He felt a surge of gratitude, mingled with sorrow for those who hadn't made it. The battlefield was silent now, but the silence was heavy, filled with the ghosts of men and the memories of terror. Mason leaned back against the log, rifle resting. On his knees, "We'll make it," he said quietly. "One step at a time." Daniel nodded, feeling the truth in the words. They had survived the worst, and though the war was far from over, for now, survival was victory enough. He closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion wash over him. The field was still, smoke curling into the sky, sunlight filtering through the broken canopy. For the first time in hours, he felt a moment of peace, however fleeting. The tree line behind them was a memory of chaos, the field ahead uncertain, but Daniel knew one thing. He had survived. Mason had survived. The captain had survived. And in that survival was the seed of hope, fragile but real, that they could face whatever came next. For Daniel, the battlefield was no longer just a place of fear. It was a testament to endurance, courage, and the will to live. Every step forward, every heartbeat, every breath was a victory. And as he looked at Mason, at the captain, at the surviving soldiers, he understood the truth of war. Survival was the ultimate triumph. And for now, they had triumphed.